Good afternoon, everybody. Now, as Elliot said, I actually used to be a student here at Cardiff University, obviously a few years ago, when I was slightly better looking, had slightly worse hair, and definitely had worse dress sense. And looking around the room today, what's slightly embarrassing is that students do seem to actually all dress much better these days. So my Facebook albums from 2009 now just look even worse. But the real reason that I'm here to talk today is because I accidentally wrote a book. Now, you're probably thinking, come on, how can you accidentally write a book? And okay, I'll level with you. It's not like I sneezed one day and looked down in my hands to find a fully finished book down there. But what I never really did was set out to write a book. It just sort of happened quite organically as a result of some of the things that I was going through in my life at the time. So a few years ago, when I was doing my Part 3, this is your professional architectural qualifications, I was working and studying at the same time, and probably doing about 80 hours a week. Now, as a bit of an aside, when you tell people you're studying architecture, the first question that they ask you is, architecture, that's like 7 years, isn't it? Every single time. So my one tip for you would be, if you ever find yourself sat next to an architect at a dinner party, ask them any question other than this one, and guaranteed they will find you interesting. It really doesn't take much. So anyway, I was studying and working at the same time, doing lots and lots of hours, and perhaps unsurprisingly, I became quite sick at this time. I came down with a bug, and I went to my doctor, and it was the usual story. Sort of the GP said, we think you've got some sort of virus, there's not a lot we can really give you, just go home, take the rest of the week off, go back in on Monday, and you'll be fine. So I did that. And then a couple of weeks later, the same sort of thing happened again. Different virus, went back to the doctor, same story. So this started to happen quite a few times, maybe 5 or 6 times. And on the last occasion, I went back to the GP, determined to get them to do some tests, whether it was blood tests or whatever. And luckily for me, this time I saw a different GP. And she was clearly really intuitive because she looked through my notes and sort of had a bit of a chat with me. And after a little while, she said to me, "How's your mental health?" And I said to her, "Well, it's fine, you know. I've never had a problem with my mental health. In my head, mental health was something that just happened to other people. It would never affect me." But she started to ask me a few questions, and I quite quickly realized maybe I wasn't fine, and actually perhaps something was wrong. So, as I said, I never expected it to happen to me, so I was kind of hit for 6 when she said to me that she suspected I was suffering with an anxiety problem. And this turned out to be the case. And thankfully, after some CBT sessions and some mindfulness, which I became trained in and did a lot of, I now meditate every single day, I began to really sort of settle back into my old life and, become healthy again. But this experience really kind of stuck with me. And I began to look into just how common mental health problems are. And that's why I've got this slide up behind me. I've picked out 6 people in that slide, and that's because every single week, 1 in 6 people will suffer with some sort of problem with their mental health. Now, to me, that's an incredible stat. It's a very sad stat, but it means that whenever you're in a group of 6 or more people, you just need to look around the room and realize that within the last week, someone there has probably had a really horrible time, and what's more, you might not even be aware of it. And what's worse, despite the diagnostic criteria for mental health getting stricter, this means the symptoms that you need to have to be diagnosed with a mental health problem, the age at which people are being diagnosed is getting younger and younger. So in the 1960s, the average onset age for depression was 45. Now it's just 14 years old. So it was a bit of a funny situation because in a strange way, knowing that other people were going through the same thing as me was quite reassuring, but also obviously quite saddening to know just the extent of this problem. So anyway, I began to think about my own mental health as well and the experience that I'd been through, particularly as a student. Now, I'd always kind of thought, as I said, that I was okay and mental health wasn't something that would affect me, but looking back, I started to realize, actually, maybe I had some pretty bad ups and downs, and at the time I'd written them off as just that, good days and bad days, or mood swings, or whatever it might be. But I started to realize that actually this was probably a problem that had been building for some time. And I started to think about the fact that maybe architecture had affected me, and architecture is renowned for being a difficult course with long hours and very competitive. And so one of the things that I try to do now is champion mental health within architecture, both the profession and for students. But I also started to consider the way that our built environment might impact our mental health. And I suppose that's probably a kind of a leap that I might naturally make, being an architect, working with buildings all the time. I suppose if I'd been a dietitian, I probably would have started to consider how food had affected my mental health. Or if I was an economist, well, I probably would have just blamed Brexit, to be honest. But no, I started to look back at the places I'd lived as a student. And I'm sure this is a sort of picture that many people can relate to. We've all lived in less than great student houses over the years, I'm sure, and maybe some of you still do. But I look back at my student houses and I realized, in some houses I've been sharing with 7 or even 8 people, so I had very little privacy. These houses were often sort of quite cramped, these old Victorian terraced houses which had low ceilings and small windows, so you weren't really getting very much natural daylight in there. And the windows themselves were often single glazed, so we were freezing from about November through to March. And I started to think, this really can't be that great for your mental health. And I now know from some of the research that I've done that actually things like mess are really bad for your mental health. Living in a place like this, actually coming home to a messy home releases cortisol into your bloodstream, which is a stress hormone. And the bad news for ladies out there is that actually this reaction is stronger in women than men, which could explain some of the arguments that I had with my mum as a teenager. But the less said about that, the better. But I don't want to speak for all students. I know that not all students live like this, but in my student house, we actually had to bring in a rule called desking, where if you left your washing up on the side in the kitchen for more than 48 hours, we would take your pots and pans and put them on your desk in your bedroom, and you'd get a strike against your name. If you got 5 strikes, you had to buy a crate of beers for the house. Now, that did seem to solve the problem, and people became much cleaner very quickly. But given that excessive alcohol also isn't great for your mental health, in hindsight, perhaps it was a bit of a flawed strategy. So I began to suspect that the built environment does have an impact on how we feel. And I'm sure most of you would agree you'd much rather live in the apartment building on the right than the one on the left. I started to look into this, and I realized there's actually tons of research out there being done by neuroscientists, by psychologists, and a lot of this actually wasn't being communicated to architects. Lots of amazing research into how our environment and external stimuli affect how we feel. So if we take colour, for example, if you give someone a cherry-flavoured drink but colour it green, which is something that neuroscientists have done, they found that actually a lot of the time people will come back to you and swear that that drink is lime-flavoured, not cherry-flavoured, purely because it's coloured green. And we're supposed to be the most intelligent creatures on the planet. For me, that made me realise that actually, external stimuli around us can have quite funny effects on the way that we think. And now they're taking this one step further in Japan, where there's culturally quite a big problem with suicide. And this is something that obviously they're trying to combat. So between 2000 and 2010, scientists at 71 train stations around Japan swapped out the normal lighting for this blue lighting at night times, with the thinking that this would help to make people calmer and less impulsive. And over those 10 years and those 71 train stations, they actually saw an 84% decrease in suicide rates, which is incredible. Obviously, this is just one study, and more research needs to be done into this sort of area. But one thing that it does tell us is that I believe our built environment definitely can change both how we feel and how we behave. And there's many, many other areas within our built environment which can have a big impact on how we feel. So, for example, the inclusion of nature, whether it's plants, water, animals, even views of nature, can have a huge impact on how we feel. So being surrounded by nature has been shown to make us calmer, increase our sense of being at home, and also even improve our memories. Now, to me, that's not particularly surprising, given that we evolved within nature over millions of years, which is something we often forget now, so many of us living in cities. But actually, the first cities were only created about 7500 BC in Mesopotamia. Obviously, it seems like a long time ago now, but across our entire evolutionary history, that's just the blink of an eye. So it really isn't surprising that nature makes us feel at home and safe. There's many other areas I've now been finding which affect how we feel, from things like the proportions of a space, the aesthetics of a space, using tactile materials like brick, timber, they can all have a big impact on how we feel. The space we spend time in can have an impact on how we feel over a longer period of time. So, for example, one study put a control group of office workers in a normal, brightly lit office environment and another group of workers in an office environment with no natural daylight. What they actually found was that the office workers with no daylight got, on average, 46 minutes less sleep per night, which is huge. Obviously, we all know that lovely feeling of being stood in warm, bright sunlight and the way that that makes us feel. But actually, to realize that this can have an impact on things like our sleep, which are responsible for much longer-term issues, is a huge thing to consider. There's a great book by Matthew Walker called Why We Sleep, in which he argues that sleep is actually more important than a good diet or even exercise. And so by reducing the amount of sleep we get, it can have huge impacts on us, both physically and mentally, increasing the chance of things like cancers and heart disease, but also increasing our chances of getting things like anxiety and depression. And what's amazing to me is that this can all be affected by the buildings that we spend time in. And I think that was really when I had the big idea behind my book, which was, what if we could use buildings to make people feel happier and actually even to improve the mental health of people around the world? Now, as I said earlier, more and more of us are living in cities. It's currently at about 50% of the world's population, and by 2050, that's set to rise to 70% of the world's population. And what's more, we spend between 80 and 90% of our time inside buildings. So that means when you're not in a building, chances are you're around a building. And the buildings that we create, if we're around them that much, I believe we have a responsibility to create buildings that do have a positive psychological impact on us. In order to do that, I think we need to share this knowledge that's coming out of neuroscience and psychology with the people creating these buildings, whether that's architects, developers, or clients in their many forms. Now, at the start, I promised that I would tell you how I accidentally wrote a book. And so I'll just finish off by explaining how that happened. As I said, I was gathering all of this research together and finding out studies from all different corners of the globe about how our built environment affects us. And at first, I didn't really know what to do with them. I just found them really interesting, and I was saving them into all kinds of different folders on my computer and bookmarks in my internet browsers. And I thought I really should start to try and do something with them. So I started to gather them into different topics, and these really actually kind of form themselves into these different groups quite organically. And I never really saw myself as an author, so I just thought I'd put together a little design guide for my own company where I work. And I called it the Happy Design Guide at first. Luckily for me, a publisher came along and heard about it and thought it was worth taking ahead. So 2 years down the line, these initial chapters have now become real chapters in a book, and I'm lucky enough to have had it published. One great thing about having never meant to publish a book is that you never really expected to make any money out of it. So to me, it doesn't really matter whether the book becomes a bestseller or whether I do make any money from it at all. But what I do hope is that it helps to educate people around the world in how to create better buildings that do make people happier and support good mental health. And I also hope that it starts to raise awareness about just how important the built environment is on affecting how we feel. Thank you all so much for listening.